Greetings, YouTube. So the Democrats lost Virginia because of CRT. The Republicans have been very good at using CRT, critical race theory, as the latest boogeyman to scare the Republican base, get them fired up, and get them to vote more of their white nationalist politicians into power. And I just saw a cogent comment someone had made that at one time in America it was perfectly safe for a Republican politician, or actually a politician in general, to use the N-word. Prior to the 1960s, that would have been a Democrat. After the 1960s, it would be a Republican. It was okay to use the N-word all the way up through the 70s. But eventually you had things get a little heated under the collar for that word. So they started using things like school busing. That was another way of talking about black people that was less inflammatory, and also welfare queen. That was very popular with the Republicans during the Reagan era. And now CRT is the latest obfuscation of the N-word, because that's what it is. They are saying the same thing over and over again to get the Republican base fired up. And if somebody comes at you saying how they oppose CRT, it's important to remember two questions. Ask them, what does it mean? And then ask them, what grade level, K through 12, is it being taught at? Well, recently, some people got really upset because their high school seniors were being taught something that they were deeply offended by. These high school seniors were taking a college level class. So these high school seniors were taking a college class. So they were bringing a college level of education into the high school. And that is why CRT was being discussed. The folks that are really upset about this, they're the children and the people and their children who, back in the 1950s and 60s, threw rocks at black kids who were getting into integrated schools. They're the ones that were throwing the invective of the N-word at black students as they were getting on buses to be taken to what had been predominantly white schools prior to that. All right? So those people don't want their children and grandchildren to be educated about the fact that their parents and grandparents are racists, have been racists for 60 years, and are continuing to be racist because they don't want their children to be educated about what has happened to black people at the hands of white people in America. This isn't making things up. This is just educating them about what actually happened in America. And they are terrified that if their children learn this, their children will look upon them, their parents and their grandparents, and come to understand that they're racist. Now, a lot of these kids already know this. They don't need CRT to inform them. I knew my father was a racist long before I ever hit high school. So it wasn't a surprise to me that, the more I learned about American history, the more obvious it became. And as an adult, I've continued to learn about American history, and I've continued to learn about systemic racism and redlining and how we have abused and oppressed and suppressed black people in America. And it is why I am so outspoken about this, because as a white person, I can discuss these things with far less fear of repercussions. And there will be white people who will listen to me because of the pigment of my skin. Also, the gray in my beard doesn't hurt. Some people will listen to a person who's older over a younger person, which is why I often find myself quoting the same types of things being said by folks who are in their 30s or 20s or even in their teen years. Because those are messages that have to be carried forward into the minds of the folks that are in my cadre and older. People in their 50s, 60s, and 70s all still have power in America. They are all still voting. And they're voting for white nationalists because they're afraid. They're afraid their children and their grandchildren are going to see them as racists because they're racists. But they don't want to think of themselves like that. They assume, and I've seen this many times, that every white person around them, every white person they encounter, is also a racist. And if a white person like me speaks out against racism, it doesn't just say I am not racist, but is speaking out about it in a manner that could be described as anti-racist, they really believe that on some deep level that I'm a racist and that I am just doing this performatively for I don't know what, because my channel doesn't make much money and I've got 6,200 subscribers, so I'm not getting a lot of attention. But they just assume that it's not possible to be a white person and not be racist because they themselves are a white person who is racist. And it's far easier just to assume that everyone that looks like them is than have to accept the fact that there are white people who aren't, which means they're the bad guy because they're the bad guy. If you support a Republican politician in America today, I don't care what your party affiliation is. I don't care if you're a Democrat, an independent, or Republican. If you vote for a Republican candidate, you are endorsing and supporting white nationalism. You are endorsing the status quo of white supremacy. And no matter how many times you say that's not true, it's true. You can't shake this off. This is dog shit you've stuffed in and you are never getting rid of it. It's that simple. You can't vote for a Republican politician and ever get the stink off of you for having done it. And CRT is helping kids to understand, college kids for the most part, occasionally high school students, seniors, that this is the reality, that their parents' voting policies, their parents' social efforts to suppress and oppress black people exists. And racists hate that. Racists hate being called a racist. They think that's worse than being a racist. Think about that for a second. I can think of few things in the world worse than being a racist, being a bigot, misogynist, being homophobe or a transphobe or a religious zealot. I can think of almost nothing worse than that other than actual crimes against other people's bodies. And yet racists think being called a racist is worse than the actual act of racism because they don't want to think of themselves as the bad guy. So when people start telling you they're afraid of CRT or they don't want their kids to learn CRT, what they're saying is, I don't want my child to learn about what I and my parents and my grandparents have done. And my father used to be a racist. He's not anymore. He's not anti-racist, but he's not a racist anymore. He's not a homophobe anymore. He's not a transphobe anymore. He respects my ex's pronouns. All right? You can change. He made those changes when he was in his 40s and his 50s. Okay, he began to move away from who he was because he realized that he was losing the people around him and came to understand that if he accepted people for who they were, he wouldn't lose his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren at this point. So you can change. Like I said, somebody starts coming at you saying CRT is bad, ask them those two questions. See what their answers are and correct them. And then ask them the one more question. What are you really